Britain has a new prime minister. So what does this mean for the special relationship between the UK and America? That's the topic on this edition of Politicking. Welcome to Politicking. I'm Laura Schwartz, sitting in for Larry King. Well, Theresa May is the new British Prime Minister and leader of the Tory party. But who is she, and what's important to know about her? Let's discuss this with Griff Whitty, the London bureau chief for The Washington Post. He joins me via Skype from London today. Griff, thanks so much for coming on.
Good to be here, Laura.
Facing one of the most difficult entrees of a prime minister since the Second World War, as described by your colleagues, how is it that Theresa May ended up as the prime minister yesterday of the UK?
Well, it's been a series of very unexpected events over the last few weeks. So the first big surprise, of course, was the referendum in which David Cameron lost his bet. He had hoped that he could get a Remain vote out of the UK. He got a Leave vote instead. He resigned the very next day. And then basically a number of very prominent Brexiteers, the politicians who had campaigned for Brexit, they all knifed each other in the back and took each other out of the running for prime minister. And at the end of the day, we were left with Theresa May, who is someone who had advocated Remain right there with Cameron. And yet now she is the prime minister, and she's going to be the person charged with leading the country to Brexit.
Well, and Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit, and she intends to do that with great success. Now, how does she intend to do that, and how do you define the success of Brexit?
Well, no one knows how she's going to do it, but that is going to be the key question that she's going to have to answer over the coming days, weeks, and months. She has given statements saying that there's no turning back, that Brexit is going to happen. One of the big questions is, when does she pull the trigger on talks with the EU? It's something that's, as soon as she pulls the trigger and invokes Article 50, which is the mechanism for getting out of the EU, Britain will have 2 years to conduct negotiations to leave. That's not very much time. And so May has said that she wants to stall perhaps until 2017 before she actually triggers those talks. But she's going to come under a lot of pressure from Brexit advocates in the UK, as well as from European leaders, to trigger the mechanism sooner than that.
That'll be very interesting to see what she does to stall. Do you think she'll be successful at stalling a couple of extra years in the admonishment or in the face of those that want to leave immediately and the EU itself? Can she find success in that?
She definitely does not have a couple of extra years. She might have a couple of extra months, which is really all we're talking about here. The UK has no common negotiating position on what it wants from Brexit talks. The government had never actually formulated a position for what it wants from this negotiation, what it wants its new relationship to be with outside of the EU, to be with the EU outside the EU. And so they're basically starting from scratch. And what May is going to want to do over the next few weeks, next few months, is figure out, what does the UK want from those talks? And only then will the government be ready to go in and trigger those negotiations.
Well, and one of the things that came up through the entire Brexit argument, of course, was the immigration issue. It was one of the driving forces beyond all on the Brexit vote. So where does May come down on this? And what does she mean when she talks about bringing control to the number of EU migrants?
Well, May's job up until now for the past 6 years had been to be the Home Affairs Secretary, which is the job where you're in charge of domestic security, and it includes immigration. And she had been seen as a real hawk on immigration, someone who had urged the government to take stronger measures to try to bring numbers down. She was basically unsuccessful in that, because the government had very little control over immigration from within the EU while it was a part of the EU. Now, of course, the question will be in these talks, the real essential question will be, how far does Britain go in limiting immigration from the rest of the EU, and how willing will the EU be in terms of letting Britain limit immigration? There's going to be a trade-off here inevitably between a limit on immigration and Europe saying, if you want to limit that immigration, you're not going to get access to the European market. You're not going to get access to our exports and imports and all the trade that Britain is currently doing.
Which is so vastly important as she tackles this big exit of the EU. Now, she's been characterized as a moderate or even a liberal conservative. What does this mean within the UK as far as her power to really make this happen?
Well, it's very interesting because we don't know who Theresa May is, what her profile is. We know where she stands on domestic security issues, but before this week, she had never really come out and stated what her positions were on the economy, on foreign policy. We're getting a glimpse of that now, and it's very interesting, and I think it's surprising to a lot of people because in her very first speech after taking the reins at Downing Street, she came up and gave a speech that could have come out of the mouth of a liberal, a Bernie Sanders type. She talked about social injustice. She talked about the need to champion the poor and the downtrodden. This was not a speech that you would accept or expect from a conservative. She's showing that perhaps she's going to take a very different path and this sort of austerity push, this growth at all costs, but not focused on equality. I think that could be something that where May changes direction and takes a different course.
Well, we're going to be staying on this course and watching it closely. And we really thank you, Griff, for your time on this very important issue today that we're watching around the world.
Thanks so much, Laura.
What might the new leadership in Britain mean for the continued fight against the Islamic State and militant extremists in the Middle East and Europe? Well, that's the topic now, as I'm joined by Michael Waltz, a former Special Forces commander who served multiple tours of duty in Afghanistan and the Middle East. He is the author of Warrior Diplomat, A Green Beret's Battles from Washington to Afghanistan. He's joining us today from Washington, D.C. Mike, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Laura.
So we'd love your read right out from the get-go on Britain's new Prime Minister, Theresa May. What do you think?
Well, there's a number of things to look at here with the election of Theresa May. And in one sense, it's a bit paradoxical. Obviously, the election is coming on the heels of the Brexit. And Theresa May was what the Brits are calling a Remainer. She actually advocated to stay in the EU. On the other hand, she's been Home Secretary since 2010 with responsibility for policing and immigration and counterterrorism, and she's known as taking a hard line on immigration. So I think those two are a bit paradoxical, but I think we can expect, frankly, from a foreign policy standpoint, a lot more of the same in terms of what Cameron has put forward.
So with the recent upheaval in the UK, along with the vote to leave the EU, what does that mean to the alliance fighting together the Islamic State?
Well, Theresa May has sent a number of signals already. One, she penned an op-ed this past May advocating for 2%, for the 2% budget target that all NATO members have signed up for in being members of NATO. And she has kind of reinforced that policy going forward. Secondly, she's worked very closely as Home Secretary with U.S. law enforcement agencies, with the U.S. intelligence community, and to a lesser degree with the Defense Department. And she's been a strong advocate of the UK being forward-leaning and heavily involved in the counter-ISIS effort, particularly as Britain is seeing so many foreign fighters coming and going into the war zone and then coming back radicalized and looking to make attacks in the UK.
So with that assessment you've got with Theresa May, how would you grade former Prime Minister now, David Cameron, on his commitment to fighting extremists in the Middle East?
Well, I think his personal commitment was fairly strong. Unfortunately, he couldn't get all of his party and then even the rest of his parliament to go along. So if you recall, Cameron led a strong effort to get the United Kingdom directly involved in bombing ISIS and in the counter-ISIS effort, and the parliament didn't support him. So, I certainly support his desire and his personal desire to be a strong member in the counter-ISIS coalition, but politically he wasn't able to get everything that he wanted.
So you think Theresa May can do it better?
Well, I'm not sure yet. I think that remains to be seen. She has continually supported Cameron's policies and even her predecessor's policies, whether that was the invasion of Iraq, the intervention in Libya, the intervention in Syria, and even now the current U.S. Policy in Iraq. So I think you're going to see more of the same, frankly, from an establishment foreign policy standpoint. I don't expect many changes. On the other hand, she is going to be heavily embroiled in how Britain is actually going to exit the European Union. So that is going to, I think, really dominate her time in terms of her focus outwards and in the foreign policy realm.
Well, and with her focus outwards, Michael, and your expertise on this, what do you think the new prime minister needs to do diplomatically and militarily to help defeat ISIS and stabilize Syria?
Well, look, I think there's the effort in Syria, but then there's even a global effort. You know, I firmly believe that we are in a global war against radical Islam. And I'd like to see the United Kingdom, as one of the main producers, frankly, of foreign fighters, both look internally and externally in a broader strategy and working with the United States and our partners on how we're going to defeat this idea. You know, it took us 60, 70 years to defeat the idea of communism from a Western perspective. And I think it's going to take just as long, if not longer, to defeat the idea and the ideology of radical Islam. And I look forward to seeing the United Kingdom be a powerful and willing participant in that bigger strategy.
Well, and you just mentioned President Obama. He recently announced his decision to leave more U.S. troops in Afghanistan than he had previously planned. Now, because of this resurgence of the Taliban, it's his reasoning. Do you agree or disagree with that decision, Michael?
Well, he was leaving more troops than he originally planned, but he's also still drawing some troops down. I mean, there's currently a little over 10,000 troops there, and he's drawing them down to about 8,800. What I disagree with is having a drawdown or a withdrawal on a timetable rather than the conditions on the ground. And President Obama's continued policy has been to announce withdrawals years in advance of them actually happening. And what I think that causes is our enemies and our friends and the region to hedge against us and to begin maneuvering for the kind of post-America Afghanistan rather than working with us. Because in their view, they've been told that we're leaving, period, and they really don't get the nuance of 8,800, 10,000 and the troop numbers. The message we need to be sending is that we are in this for the long haul, that we are going to defeat Islamic extremism, and the Afghans are our partners in that effort.
Well, Michael, certainly thank you for your observations. And for more on your writings, please follow the links on his Twitter feed under his handle @MGGWALTZ. Stay right there. More politicking after the break. Welcome back to Politicking. I'm Laura Schwartz, sitting in for Larry King. Joining me now in studio is Joel Pollak, political commentator and senior editor-at-large at Breitbart News. He is also the author of the new book out later this month called See No Evil, The 19 Hard Truths the Left Can't Handle. Joel, we're thrilled to have you in the studio today. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be back here.
You know, a lot has been made. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but we want to start with the Brexit vote. The ascendancy of Theresa May just yesterday as Britain's second female prime minister. What might they signal with this new prime minister as the eventual outcome of the U.S. presidential contest here in the U.S.?
Well, it's hard to know, but it's clear that on both sides of the Atlantic, voters are moving in the direction of national sovereignty. People want to feel like they have control over what's happening in their own country, over what's happening in their lives. And for various reasons, people feel that they don't have any control, whether economic or political. And I think that there could be a reflection of that vote in England or in Britain here in the United States. Now, on the other side, of course, Hillary Clinton supporters would say, well, they have a female prime minister. That's also the way things might go in the U.S. People might decide they're ready to have a woman lead the United States. We haven't had any female presidents. They're on their second female prime minister. But I think the movement on both sides is really towards nationalism, if I can put it that way, or at least towards sovereignty, self-determination, away from transnational institutions, away from multinational cooperation, which worried some people at first. On the other hand, as the Brexit campaigners pointed out, there's no reason Britain can't have good or better relations with other countries once it's making more of its own policies. In fact, policies that it makes when it's more independent might have more staying power because they'll have greater popular legitimacy. So Trump wants to take us in the same direction policy-wise. Clinton might take us in the same direction gender-wise. It's hard to know. But certainly the theme of sovereignty is very powerful, not just in Britain, but here as well.
Well, and you spoke about the relationships. What does this mean, Brexit and the new prime minister overall, for the U.S.-UK relations? We've always had this special relationship between our two countries. What is this going to mean going forward?
I think the relationship will remain fine. I think President Obama has lost a personal ally in David Cameron. The two of them were often very buddy-buddy, going to basketball games together and that sort of thing. Obama's support tends to be the kiss of death for foreign leaders. But David Cameron wasn't the first, won't be the last. And I think despite the decline in relationships between governments, I think the relationships between people and countries are very strong. There are many Americans who take heart from Brexit, not just Trump supporters, but on the left you've got Bernie Sanders supporters who want to see the United States exert different kinds of policies when it comes to free trade or to NATO and military engagements around the world. So I think that there will be some turbulence, maybe politically, just for the last few months of Obama's presidency, but overall I think the special relationship will remain that. And you saw Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump asserting that they would maintain very strong relationships with Britain, regardless of the Brexit vote and in the aftermath.
Well, more broadly even, in Europe's rising tide of their right-wing populism, you touched a bit about the Donald Trump supporters as well as a Bernie Sanders supporter really seeing the light of Brexit. But what is this right-wing populism really going to have an impact in the U.S. elections come November?
I think it's important to distinguish between right-wing populism of the sort that's been bubbling up in various European countries now for the past couple of decades, and that has already won elections in certain places, won a number of seats in parliaments around continental Europe, and which in some ways represents a throwback to a bad kind of nationalism, harking back to the mid-20th century. I think there are some parties that have positions that should be concerning to anybody. I think what's happening in Brexit and what's happening with the Trump movement here is quite different. I think that Mr. Trump is not really a historical or traditional conservative, as many conservatives will be very quick to inform you. He's not really coming from that world of right-wing populism. He's a populist, but really more of a centrist populist. And I think for that reason, he's attracting a lot of people who normally vote Democratic. He has provided the Republicans with that elusive cross-party vote with those Reagan Democrats who had lost interest in politics for many years. And while there are some on the right who have views that are very far to the right who support Donald Trump, I think that's a minority of the Trump coalition. So I don't think he's in the same category. And I also would say the same about Brexit. I think there are people from the center who supported Brexit. In fact, there were towns, industrial centers in Britain with large labor contingencies that voted for Brexit and voted with the Tories who were in favor. Actually, the Tory politicians were in favor of staying in the EU, but for those Tories who were leading the Brexit charge along with the UK Independence Party. So you're seeing a kind of appeal across political lines with some of these themes that have nothing to do with left or right, but really more to do with sovereignty and independence.
So with the rise of the sovereignty and independence and Donald Trump in the U.S., will they see this as being beneficial to Russians, Vladimir Putin?
That's a very good question. I mean, Russia was certainly happy to see the Brexit vote because Russia's strategy in Europe is to divide Europe even further. Russia doesn't want a united Europe. They don't want NATO on their doorstep. They want to disrupt Western alliances as far as possible. Trump has been friendlier to Russia than many other conservatives have been. At the same time, Hillary Clinton has possibly the most pro-Russia record of any politician. She masterminded the Russia reset, which turned out very badly when she was Secretary of State, and probably her top failure as Secretary of State after Libya. So it's hard to see how Russia will change its strategy to the United States going forward. I think whoever's in office, they will try to disrupt and distract. Putin has been friendlier to Trump because Trump's been making some friendlier noises toward Russia.
We'll continue the conversation with Joel Pollak right after the break. Well, and you're right about that. Donald Trump has raised eyebrows with his praise of Putin, but he's also praised Saddam Hussein, even Kim Jong-un. Thoughts on his seemingly soft spot for autocratic and authoritarian personalities? Do you find that worrying in the Breitbart community and beyond here in the U.S.?
Well, Trump's approach to history with regard to Saddam Hussein is somewhat revisionist. So I don't really take his comments on Saddam that seriously. I don't think he was a vocal opponent of the war that he pretends to be now. I think a lot of that is just rhetoric. The left actually seems to have a softer spot historically for dictators. I mean, Jimmy Carter in his presidency and post-presidency, has almost never met a dictator he didn't like. And Hillary Clinton was very, very friendly towards the Assad regime in Syria. John Kerry and his wife having dinner with Assad and his wife. The Democratic approach under George Bush was to be friendly to dictators because they wanted to contrast diplomacy with Bush's approach, which was more confrontational. Neither Clinton nor Trump are really on board with the pro-democracy agenda of George W. Bush, which had its deep flaws and worked out not as well as the Bush people would have liked, but at least had some kind of moral component to it. You can argue that that moral component is not really appropriate in international affairs, and that's a very strong argument these days. But I think Hillary and Trump both have a record of trying to coddle foreign leaders even if they don't agree with them. And right now the American public seems to be on their side.
Well, it'll be interesting because next week at the Republican National Convention, we will see this Trump skill, to whatever degree that will end up being, on stage in Cleveland, Ohio. What is your assessment of the Trump campaign vis-a-vis the GOP and the country overall? There's still many movements saying that they're going to be there at Cleveland protesting against Trump. Trump has shown his skill in very different ways. What do you think that skill will be on stage next week?
Well, you know, when I think of Trump on stage, I think of WWE and wrestling chairs, you know, smashed over heads and things like that. But it's going to be entertaining. Right now, Trump and Clinton are tied in several swing states as we sit here. They're actually even in Ohio, where the convention will be. And Cleveland is basically running out of hotel rooms. It's not got the capacity for this convention, but the reason the Republicans chose to have their convention there was to appeal to Ohio voters. And Trump's
and yet
also,
their governor's not even going to come to the convention.
It's going to be a free-for-all. I was joking with my colleagues that I should buy a Cleveland Browns football helmet just to wear as I enter the venue every day. And we're sort of splitting our coverage between people inside talking to politicians and people outside on the street talking to police and protesters, you know, and ducking the rocks and bottles and tear gas or whatever. It is going to be crazy. And hopefully we can keep a lid on the violence. I think the country's seen a bit too much of that lately. But I think you'll see some of the same in Philadelphia. I mean, the Philadelphia union at the airport has just announced that they're going on strike during the Philadelphia Democratic National Convention. So good luck getting there and getting there with your bags. I mean, we're going to see chaos, I think, at both parties' conventions because there's a great deal of unrest in the country and disquiet with the respective establishments of both political parties. So it's going to be interesting, and I hope we all survive.
Moving on to the vice presidential pick, which is sometimes the most exciting part of a convention. We know who the president's going to be. We can wonder, especially about Trump, what he's going to sound like and act like on that big stage, that platform on the world stage where everyone will be watching. But it's highly suspected that in the next few days, possibly tomorrow, we will hear who he picks as his vice presidential candidate running mate. Joel, any idea who that's going to be?
I hear rumors that Kanye West is making his way to Cleveland.
He got the T-shirt made up, the bumper stickers ready to go.
Well, you know, he's a good candidate because he offers a contrast to Trump. Trump can say, see, I'm not as crazy as this guy. No, it looks like it could be Mike Pence of Indiana. Trump's been hinting all along that he's going to choose a seasoned politician, maybe a governor. He needs somebody, I think, with a history of service in government, with some kind of anchor on policy. Conservatives will be very happy with Pence. Pence is interesting because he endorsed Ted Cruz in the Indiana primary. So that'll be seen as a unity pick, a sort of appeal to Cruz supporters. Who knows where it'll end up going? I think Pence would be a good pick. I don't think it's going to matter much. I think the contrast between the two personalities at the top of the ticket is going to be what voters are looking at, Hillary versus Donald. And we'll see. And I don't know who Hillary's going to pick either. I don't think Bernie Sanders is interested at all in the job. I'm not sure what he's interested in, actually, because he seemed to throw in the towel rather quickly earlier this week. But we'll see. I think Pence would be good. There's a few other names running that I think would be great. But, you know, he could surprise us. I mean, this is Donald Trump. He doesn't play by the rules.
Right, and I think that's why everybody's looking so closely at his VP pick. Is it going to be the sensible one to balance it out, or is it going to be somebody out there as the bulldog to rival him? But either way, Joel, we know that you'll be watching it. And we just want to, again, say congratulations on your new book out later this month is See No Evil, the 19 Hard Truths the Left Can't Handle. Remember, we love hearing from you. Join the conversation on Larry's Facebook page. And as always, you can share your thoughts on Twitter by tweeting @KingsThings and using the PoliticKING hashtag. I also invite you to join me on Twitter @LauraSchwartz. From there, you'll find links to my work and website. So that's all for this edition of PoliticKING. And I thank you for joining us once again today.